Everyone knows the classic story of Alice in Wonderland, a curious girl who follows a rushed rabbit and ends up falling into a completely insane world, full of bizarre creatures and situations that defy logic. For many, it's just a magical and surreal adventure, a product of a young girl's imagination. But what if that's not the case? What if all this fantasy hides something much darker? Imagine, for a moment, that Alice isn't venturing through a wonderland, but is instead trapped in a much more terrifying place, her own mind, deteriorating due to confinement in an asylum, the eccentric characters she encounters, equally disturbed patients, the bizarre changes in her size and the distorted spaces, symptoms of cruel treatments or psychiatric drugs affecting her perception. This new perspective turns the fable into a dark journey through Alice's internal struggle to escape her own madness. Normally, Alice in Wonderland is seen as a story about curiosity and discovery. Alice is taken to a magical place where anything is possible, a world that defies the rules of logic and reason, but at the same time, seems fascinating to children and adults alike who want to lose themselves in a good fantasy. But in this darker version, Wonderland isn't a magical place. It's actually the result of a mind in collapse. Instead of falling down a rabbit hole to enter this new world, Alice might be falling deeper into her own disturbed psyche. The surreal landscapes and strange creatures are, in fact, manifestations of her battle against madness, as if Wonderland were a metaphor for the fragmented state of her mind, the chaos and lack of logic. Clear symptoms of a mind losing control. The scariest part of this theory is that every piece of the strange land Alice explores can be interpreted as a layer of her mental disorder. It's not just a dream or an adventure. It's a mental escape forced by the unbearable confinement in an asylum, where the figures she meets and the events she experiences represent fragments of her own sanity that are crumbling. Alice isn't simply chasing a rabbit. She's trying to hold on to any fragment of reality as her mind deteriorates faster and faster. If Wonderland is truly a manifestation of Alice's mind, then the bizarre characters she encounters aren't just magical creatures. They may be projections of other patients confined in the same asylum, each displaying symptoms of different mental disorders. First, we have the Mad Hatter. He's undoubtedly one of the most eccentric and unhinged characters in the story. He lives in a perpetual cycle of endless tea parties, repeating irrational behaviors and obsessed with time. This repetition and obsession may suggest compulsive disorder or even schizophrenia, where the perception of reality is completely distorted. Inside the asylum, the Hatter would be a patient living in his own world, trapped in his meaningless rituals, unable to distinguish what is real and what is not. He's not crazy, in the funny sense. He's trapped in a mind that imprisons him with repetitions and delusions. Then there's the March Hare, whose behavior is equally disturbing. Always jittery, disoriented, and in a constant state of anxiety, she seems to represent a condition of extreme tension and paranoia. Perhaps she's the reflection of another patient in the asylum who suffers from severe anxiety disorder, unable to find peace or logic in her environment, just as Alice finds no logic in Wonderland. And we can't forget the Cheshire Cat, who appears and disappears at will, always with that enigmatic grin. He could be seen as a patient in a state of dissociation, unable to fully connect with what's around him. His mysterious behavior and ability to vanish might symbolize how patients with dissociative disorders disconnect from reality, floating between the real world and their distorted perception. Each of these characters, instead of being magical and funny creatures, becomes a distorted reflection of real patients, each dealing with their own form of mental suffering. For Alice, these encounters may be representations of how she perceives her fellow inmates, people who, like her, are struggling to survive their chaotic reality within the asylum. Alice's constant size changes are one of the most iconic elements of the story. She eats a cookie and grows to an enormous size, then drinks a liquid and shrinks to a tiny size. For many, this is just a funny fantasy, but in the darker version of the asylum theory, these size changes can be seen as symptoms of the side effects of psychotropic drugs or brutal psychiatric treatments of the time. Imagine Alice being forced to take heavy medication, common in psychiatric institutions of the past when the treatment of mental disorders was still rudimentary and cruel. These drugs often induced strong hallucinations, dizziness, and distortions in body perception. The feeling of growing or shrinking could be exactly how Alice feels after receiving doses of sedatives or substances that directly affect the brain, confusing her perception of herself and the world around her. Every time Alice consumes something in Wonderland, whether it's cake, mushrooms, or mysterious liquid, she experiences a physical distortion that reflects these possible chemical experiences. The sensation of growing may symbolize a state of hypersensitivity, where everything around her seems to be amplifying and becoming overwhelming, while shrinking may represent a phase of extreme weakness or dissociation, where she feels insignificant and unable to defend herself. These effects could be linked to what were considered treatments for her conditions, but which in reality only drove her deeper into an abyss of mental confusion. This interpretation also casts a new light on how Wonderland reacts to Alice. The environment around her seems to adjust as her size changes, as if reflecting how lost she feels. The world becomes gigantic when she feels powerless, and shrinks when she feels she might have some control. But deep down, Alice is being manipulated by external forces, not by magic, but by doctors and treatments that are profoundly affecting her mental state. The size changes thus become a metaphor for how Alice is at the mercy of the side effects of drugs and invasive practices in the asylum. She has no control over what happens to her body or her mind, and all she can do is try to adapt, as best she can, to each new crisis that the medications induce. The Queen of Hearts is undoubtedly one of the most menacing characters in Alice in Wonderland. With her famous phrase, "Off with their head," she commands fear and absolute obedience from everyone around her. In the dark theory that Alice is in an asylum, the Queen of Hearts could represent a merciless authority figure, perhaps a severe nurse, a cruel doctor, or even the system itself, controlling Alice's life with an iron fist. In Alice's world, the Queen of Hearts rules with a volatile and unpredictable temper. At any moment, she can decree a death sentence without reason, mirroring the constant fear Alice may feel inside the asylum. The Queen of Hearts' rules and logic make no sense, just as the asylum may be a place where punishment and repression are constant, with no clear reason or justice. The phrase, "off with their head," could be seen as a metaphor for the power these authority figures have to destroy the individuality and sanity of their patients. Moreover, the Queen of Hearts' court is full of subservient and ridiculous figures, like the playing card soldiers, who obey orders blindly without question. This could symbolize how other patients, and even the asylum staff, are completely submissive to the system. They follow the rules without questioning, as if they are trapped in an order they never challenge, no matter how irrational it may be. The Queen of Hearts also represents the constant threat hanging over Alice. No matter what she does, it seems she's always one step away from being punished or losing everything. For Alice, the Queen of Hearts could be the reflection of her deepest fear, the fear of being cut off or destroyed by those who hold power over her life in the asylum. She has no control over her own existence, and the Queen embodies that despair and the vulnerability of being under the authority of someone who can decide her fate with a single command. In the end, the Queen of Hearts isn't just a caricatured villain, but a symbol of the institutionalized oppression and fear Alice faces in the asylum. She becomes the ultimate enemy, not only in Wonderland, but within Alice's own mind, the personification of everything she cannot control in her life, the fear that keeps her trapped in this endless cycle of hallucinations and delusions. Alice's trial in Wonderland is one of the story's most confusing and chaotic scenes. There, she finds herself in the midst of a completely insane court, where logic is replaced by absurdities, and the Queen of Hearts dictates everyone's fate with the same irrationality that marks the rest of her reign. In the theory that Alice is in an asylum, this scene takes on a much darker meaning. It's the point where her mind desperately tries to make sense of everything, while she constantly feels judged by those who hold power over her. The trial can be seen as a metaphor for how Alice feels in the asylum, a place where she is being constantly analyzed and judged. Doctors and nurses observe her, evaluate her behavior, and often make decisions that directly affect her future, without her having any control over the process. The chaos of the court represents the confusion Alice feels as she tries to understand these evaluations. The rules seem nonsensical, and she never knows what will come next. Just like the treatments and procedures she is subjected to in the asylum, the court is governed by the Queen of Hearts, who represents the oppressive authority that holds Alice captive. None of Alice's arguments make sense to the court, and she is unjustly judged for crimes she didn't commit. This reflects the helplessness she must feel being constantly deemed crazy or incurable. The trial is yet another tool of control and oppression, a demonstration of absolute power where Alice will never have a voice or a real chance to defend herself. What's most disturbing is that the trial seems to have no end, just like Alice's confinement in the asylum. The court is a manifestation of Alice's desperation to be understood, to be heard, but every word she says is distorted, ignored, or ridiculed. It's the peak of her mental crisis, where she's on the verge of completely losing control of her sanity. However, right after the trial, something curious happens. Alice wakes up. This awakening can be seen in two ways. In the darker interpretation, this awakening is not a return to reality, but a transition from an acute crisis to a more stable, yet still disturbed, state. Alice doesn't wake up in her bed, happy and safe. Instead, she returns to the asylum, where reality is just a less chaotic but still suffocating version of her previous experience. The trial, then, represents the climax of her battle against her own mind, a battle that, in the end, she can never truly win. This final crisis is where everything converges. The chaos of Wonderland and the brutality of the asylum merge. Alice, even awake, remains trapped. She may have survived the trial in her mind, but she is still far from escaping the harsh and oppressive reality that surrounds her. Throughout this distorted journey, we have gone from an enchanted and surreal world to a much more disturbing vision. Wonderland is not a magical place, but a reflection of Alice's fractured mind, trapped in an asylum. From the eccentric creatures who could be other patients, to the size changes suggesting the impact of heavy drugs, to the Queen of Hearts as an oppressive figure of authority, every aspect of the story points to Alice's internal struggle against her own mind. The chaotic trial, where Alice desperately tries to be understood, is the height of this mental crisis, representing the moment when she is judged, not for her crimes, but for her condition. When she finally wakes up, we don't know for sure if she truly escaped this cycle of madness, or if she just moved from one hallucination to an equally oppressive reality. This dark take on Alice in Wonderland makes us think, what if all Alice wanted was to escape, not to a world of wonders, but from her own mental prison? Perhaps Wonderland was her only way to survive a cruel reality, where oppression, invasive treatments, and constant judgment forced her to hide within her own mind. In the end, we're left with a disturbing question. Did Alice truly wake up? Or is she still a prisoner, not in Wonderland, but inside her own head, confined by forces far greater than she can control? The answer, like Alice's true fate, we may never know. If you enjoyed this dark theory and want more content like this, don't forget to leave your like. It really helps the channel. And of course, click on the video that's about to appear on your screen to keep diving into more theories and mysteries from the world of animation. See you there.